So I want to talk to you guys about Germany supporting Ukrainian nationalists during the Second World War and how this is really a part of a pattern within Germany's history of supporting different nationalistic groups, paramilitaries, which are very vicious, violent, and evil, and how Germany uses these as its proxies, regardless of how evil these groups are. So during the Second World War, Germany supported Ukrainian nationalists. And these Ukrainian nationalists were extremely sympathetic to the Nazi cause. They both the German Nazis and the Ukrainian nationalists shared the same hatred for Polish people. They both wanted to destroy Polish people. The Ukrainians wanted to exterminate the Poles in Volhynia, in East Galicia, and in other areas, and they wanted to expand Ukraine and take territory that they believed was stolen by the Poles from Ukraine. And they had this blood and soil way of thinking, kill Polish people, Russians, Jews, etc. The same type of genocidal, maniacal sentiment that you see amongst the Nazis. And the Germans provided these Ukrainian fascists with training, military training. Germany had various training camps within its country, and Ukrainians were training in these camps. Uh, and the support for Ukrainian nationalists did not just begin with the Third Reich. It didn't just begin with the Nazis. It was there before 1914. It's very, very old. In fact, I want to read to you guys a quote from an article that was published by the Times of London in 1930. I'm getting this from this book, Poland's Holocaust by Tadeusz Petrovsky. I got about 60 or so pages left until I finish reading this book. Very long book, arduous read, brutal, but it's very graphic, and it just gives you the cold hard facts of how brutal it was in Poland during the Second World War, and the different groups, militias, paramilitaries, governments that wanted to kill Polish people. The Germans wanted to exterminate the Poles. The communists wanted to force Poland to become communist. And then you had the Belarusian collaborators who were working with the Germans to kill Polish people because Poland had taken control over Western Belarus. And then you had the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian collaborators who were working with the Germans because they believed that through the Germans they could exterminate the Poles living in the territories that they believed rightfully belonged to Ukraine, and they could take that territory. And the Germans wanted to use the Ukrainians to help them exterminate the Poles. Because with the Germans, it was part of this ideology of Lebensraum, of creating living space for the German race. We need to create more living space for the Germans, and in order to do so, we have to kill all the Poles, slaughter them, enslave them, do what we want, do what we feel we have to do to purge the world of Polish people. So there's an article here, and this is from the book. In the appendix, in the back of the book, it has a number of publications, well, a number of articles from various publications, documents, and the like. And in this article published by the Times of London, it says here that the interest of German military circles in Ukrainian nationalism is nothing new. It was well established before 1914. And the Germans provided training. The Germans backed the Ukrainians to use them as a proxy to exterminate the Poles. This idea of using the Ukrainians to exterminate the Poles can be traced back. The idea of using them can be traced back to the main ideologue for the Third Reich, Alfred Rosenberg. He was a man who hated Christianity. He wanted the Germans to go back to their pagan religion. He even went so far as to say that Germans should return to the worship of Ahura Mazda, the god of the ancient Persians, because the Germans are essentially Aryans and the Persians were Aryans and still are Aryans. And so Germans should go back to their pagan past. They should go so far back that they shouldn't just worship Odin. They shouldn't just stick with Odin. They should go further back than that to their their original Aryan religion of worshiping Ahura Mazda, of Zoroastrianism. And the guy was really that crazy. He was really that insane. Well, he wasn't insane. He was diabolical. He was demonic. And he was very sinister person. And Alfred Rosenberg believed in using the Ukrainians as a proxy for Germany to annihilate the Polish people. And I want to read to you guys a quote from Rosenberg, and it's presented in the book by Petrovsky. Rosenberg wrote, "Once we have understood that the elimination of the Polish state is the first demand of Germany, an alliance between Kiev and Berlin and the creation of a common border become a necessity of people and state for a future German policy. Destroy Poland, make Poland non-existent, make Poland basically Lebensraum for the Germans, and in that case, in that situation, Germany and Ukraine will be bordering neighbors. Ukraine will be bordering with Germany because there will be no Poland. Poland will not exist after we fulfill this genocidal aspiration." And so it goes back to this pagan named Alfred Rosenberg. Not solely him, but this idea of using the Ukrainians to exterminate the Poles can be traced back to this guy. Yeah. And so that was history, you say, right? Oh, that's history. Who cares about that, right? That was decades and decades ago. My grandparents were little kids then, or, my great grandparents were alive, but they're no longer alive. So who really cares about any of this stuff? But when we realize that Germany's support for Ukrainian nationalists does not begin with the Nazis, that it goes back before 1914, before World War I, then we can start to think, well, if it's that old and that continuous, does it still continue today? Is this still happening today? Is this really a reflection of a pattern within Germany's foreign policy? And I believe that it is. Not just with Ukrainian nationalists, but with other vicious ideologues, vicious ideological paramilitary groups. For example, in the 1990s, who supported the KLA? Who supported the KLA? Who helped to create the KLA? For those of you who don't know, the KLA was the Kosovo Liberation Army. It was an Islamo-Nazi paramilitary group that murdered Serbs, murdered Serbian civilians for this idea of a Serb-free Kosovo in the 1990s in the Balkans. And it was these Albanian nationalists who were also involved in organs trafficking. And by organs trafficking, I don't mean that they were just transporting organs. These people were murdering civilians, Serbian civilians, also Albanians as well, and taking their organs, murdering people to take their organs. But what's interesting is that before the Americans were backing the KLA by bombing the Serbs, the Germans were arming the KLA and training the KLA. Really, the beginning of German foreign policy after the Second World War can really be seen quite conspicuously, explicitly, in the German support for the KLA. And a lot of these Albanians that Germany was supporting were Nazis themselves. These were people who were very proud about how their grandparents were Nazis, how their grandparents were Albanian collaborators with the Nazis. These were Albanian Nazis. And the Germans were supporting these Albanian neo Nazis, armed them, trained them, the whole thing. During the Second World War, the Nazis did the same exact thing with the Albanians. Gave them guns, made them a part of the SS to murder Serbs. They did the same thing with the Croats, with the Croatian Ustashi, Croatian Nazis, and they did the same thing with the Bosnians. And in the 1990s, who did the Germans support? The Albanians, the Bosnians, the Croatians. Germany's foreign policy hasn't changed. It has not changed. And during the Euromaidan revolution, in which there were many Nazis, all part of the right sector, Azov paramilitary, who supported the Euromaidan revolution? It was the EU, it was NATO. Germany 100% supported the Euromaidan revolution, in which there were many fascists that were involved. I want to make a reference to a book here that I read a couple of years ago. It's called Neo-Nazis and Euromaidan by two political analysts, Stanislav Bishuk and Alexei Kochetkov. And it talks about how Ukrainian intelligence was involved with these Ukrainian neo-Nazis. And he talks about a man by the name of Valentin Nalivaychenko. He was the head of Ukrainian intelligence from 2006 to 2010, and he was heavily involved with these Ukrainian Nazis who were involved in the Euromaidan, with Right Sector specifically. Right Sector is a paramilitary group, but it's also very political, and they have their own political party called Svoboda. And when you're dealing with Ukrainian intelligence, you can't just separate that from Western intelligence, because all the support for Ukraine is coming from where? It's coming from the West. It's coming from the EU. It's coming from NATO. You cannot disconnect Ukrainian intelligence from the US and from the European Union. In fact, during the Euromaidan revolution, the world watched as John McCain made a speech literally right next to the leader of Svoboda. In this book, it reads, quote, "On December 15th, John McCain, U.S. Republican senator and anti-communist, well known for his support for the Svoboda Party, and Chris Murphy, U.S. Democratic senator, appeared on the stage on the Euromaidan. Quote, 'We are here to talk about solidarity on behalf of the American people,' McCain addressed the crowd. 'Your peaceful protest and your peaceful fight are inspiring all the country and the world to change. We are here to support your just cause, the sovereign right of Ukraine to determine its own destiny freely and independently, and the destiny you seek lies in Europe.'" It's very interesting that McCain would say your destiny lies in Europe, meaning follow the European Union, which means ultimately your destiny lies with Germany, because the head of the EU is Germany. And you can see a picture of John McCain sharing a platform with the leader of Ukraine's neo-Nazi party, Ole Tihanibuk. And another thing that I want to mention is that when the Russians were fighting the Chechens back in the 1990s, it was Ukrainian Nazis who went to the North Caucasus to fight for the Chechens against the Russians. And when the Armenians were fighting the Azeris, also in the 1990s, it was Ukrainian neo-Nazis who went to the South Caucasus to fight against the Armenians in support for the Azeris in Nagorno-Karabakh. So right here we have the Nazi Islamic collaboration in the 1990s, just as it was during the Second World War when the Germans were backing the Bosnians and the Albanians. And just as it was in the 1990s when the German government was supporting, training, and arming the KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army, the Albanian neo-Nazi paramilitary. All of this history interconnects. It all interconnects. And so looking at history in the 1930s, 1940s, you see, okay, Germany backed Ukrainian nationalists. Germany backed Albanian Nazis. Germany backed Bosnians and Croatian fascists. But then you fast forward to the 1990s and you see, wait a second, Germany is supporting Albanians. Germany is supporting the Croatians and the Bosnians. And you see the EU supporting the Ukrainian nationalist Euromaidan. You see John McCain with Ole Tihanabuk. You read an article about how German medics were helping wounded Ukrainian neo-Nazi fighters, and one of them actually made the Nazi salute as he was lying on the stretcher. You look at all this modern history, and you can connect it with the Second World War. You can connect it with the past, and you can really see a pattern in Germany's history and how it hasn't changed all that much. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.